Hello and welcome. My name is Josh Burns, and today I'm going to be doing another tutorial. This one is going to be based on something that people have been asking a lot about, and that's the terrain that I've been making. So this is a great way to create some 3D terrain without that much 3D knowledge, just using the tools that are available from Adobe. But there are some things that are very important that are going to make it a lot easier and make your results that much better. So let's get started. Alright, so first off, I want to create a new file, and this I usually just go with a square size, but you can really choose any dimension you want. I went with 1500 by 1500, and the other important thing is to use a 16-bit image, not 8-bit, and not 32. Not 32 just because a lot of the tools, filters and that sort of thing, those go away when you're using 32 bits, so with 16 you still have most of the options, so that's good to have. Okay, so here's your image. So first off, I just want to create a gray fill here, just to sort of give you an idea of what we're going to be doing. Alright, and then I'm just going to throw on a new layer and just draw some dots in, just some white dots. Okay, so basically what I'm showing right now is just sort of the main principle of creating this terrain. Okay, I'm just going to blur these out a bit so that there is a bit of gradation in the actual shape. And then I'm going to go to 3D at the top and create a mesh from grayscale and choose plane. Alright, so it extrudes based on the black and white value. So gray is sort of a baseline, white is high, and black, if we had any black in the image, black would be low. So that's it. Tutorial over. Actually, something that's important to remember is if you had chosen 8-bit as opposed to 16-bit, the sides of the curves and all that would be a lot more jagged, whereas this is a nice smooth shape. So that's important to know. And when I am making terrain, what I like to do right off the bat is sort of make it parallel with the ground, just so I know what I'm looking at and I can pan around as I would. It's actually a good tip as well, is to not move the object but move the camera, just so you know your object is square, because when you go to export the actual OBJ, it should be square, or else it'll just cause some problems when you get into Element. Alright, so basically those dots, that was just to show the basic technique. So you can go in and edit this depth map on the fly, so you can actually, we'll be going back and forth between this depth map and the actual file, and that's sort of a file that's created self-contained within the actual PSD. It's a PSB file. Alright, so first thing, I'm just going to add clouds. That's a really good baseline. I don't know why they don't call it fractal noise. They should really talk to the people over at the After Effects side of things and maybe give it some more options, because it's pretty basic right now. So, and then just add difference clouds along with that on top, so that'll create a real valley sort of up and down shape to it. Now I know this looks pretty extreme right now, but if you have your black and white values like this, this is what you get. This is sort of the depth, and I haven't found a way to actually adjust the threshold of the depth, but what you can do is take this image here and actually you can scale it vertically and bring that down. That way in your depth map you still have all that high black and white value to play around with, and also visually to see it, because you really have to have an eye for what you're looking at. If all your grays were like, okay, 20% gray and 30% gray, you're not going to see that much of a difference. Or, well, there's a bit of a difference, but it's going to be harder to tell as opposed to 25% and 50%. So what you do is just to get this to a little bit nicer shape or nicer scale, you scale the Y value. So with this you can control the scale of the object, or along the top of Photoshop. Let's see here now. This is a little bit more, it's a bit closer to what I've been creating for the other terrain that I've been doing. So you can see now it's a little bit nicer to work with, but the nice thing about this is you have all that black and white value, that depth to play around with when you're actually drawing on your map. And you can just actually click off the diffuse value, because it kind of can be a little bit confusing, because it makes things look a little bit deeper because they are darker, because it seems like it's a deeper shadow. And you just double click on the depth map there and go back in, and we can start playing around with it. Now one thing you do is if you want to create like a plateau type area, you can use curves to do that. you just create a baseline here where it was on a slope, and what that will do is it'll actually flatten it out and create some plateaus for you, sort of like some cliffs. And you can see how it's flattened out there. And this is often what I'll do, is I'll start with the clouds and then adjust that a bit and get kind of the shape I'm going for, and then flatten some areas out, because obviously you're going to want some things on the ground. I just like to keep this sort of, you know, adjusting it as I go. I'm not going to go into the depth map and, you know, make a giant global change. If I want just everything to be a bit higher, I can go in and adjust the scale. So that's pretty good there. You get some nice plateaus, some higher points, some low points. In the valleys though, it's a little bit rough right now. So another thing too is with that cloud setting, you can just, you know, go back into the depth map and, you know, smooth it out a bit. So all you have to do is just blur it a bit. And what that'll do is on these points here, sometimes it'll take, because basically it's a grid of triangles. It's a 3D grid, and those triangles get extruded a little bit too much and pull, and they look kind of bad. So what you can do is just soften that up a bit using just blur. There you go. And what that does is just softens everything out. It makes it a little smoother. Now just let that update. There we go. And so now the peaks aren't quite so jagged. The floor level is still a little bit rough, but that's not too bad. Alright, so this is a pretty good sort of setup. Obviously you're going to have your stage area. Like a lot of times what I'll do is I'll have a lot of background area, but then I'll have another area that's sort of my main stage where I'm going to be having all of my, you know, action happening, or a valley where, you know, the camera's going to be weaving through, like in the vault video that I did. If you go into the 3D options and you see here set to wireframe and zoom in, this will give you an idea of what it's done here to create these shapes. Now, what I was talking about the jagged points is it's because these triangles here have become quite long, whereas the ones on the flat level are still, you know, pretty uniform. And this is important when we actually bring it into Element and we're choosing how to use the UVs. So we'll cover more of that later. Basically, you have to know that Photoshop is not creating a perfect 3D object. It's kind of just taking a flat sheet of vertices and pushing up and pushing down and sort of not adjusting where those pixels are. If we were to look at a top view of that wireframe, it would still look the same. But you look at side view, it's pulling these up and creating some really long triangles. So more about that in a little bit. Alright, so I'm just going to grab the Marquee Tool, and this is with my stage. I want to create the area that I want the action to be happening, or the area that I want, you know, to have the whatever I'm building placed in, or where I want the camera. This is basically where you want a little bit more control. So I'm just going to draw in a little marquee around here. Okay, and basically just grab the same color as in the valley and do a fill. There you go. And then if you want, you can set it to multiply and then make it slightly opaque as well. Play around with it, maybe blur the edges a bit so it's smooth to the actual shape. But basically you want to create some areas that are, you know, some flat areas where it's easy to place objects or anything like that. Now you can see if we rotate it a bit. So now we have this area that's, you know, not all full of rocks, and you can have some actual action happening for your scene. So that covers off basically how I make the terrain. There's a lot of different things you can do. It's basically whatever you can do with Photoshop. Here I'm adding just a gradient over top, and what that will do is all those white areas will be pushed up even more, and that center area will be a bit lower, so it'll create more of a dip, more of a crater shape. But really it's totally up to you what you want to do. And okay, so I'm just going to put all this in a folder and just make it invisible for now. Just turn that off, and we're going to show a couple of things. So if you're looking to do more of a exact shape, obviously with the clouds you're not going to be able to do, say, a curve like this. What you can do is again use the 3D functionality of Photoshop to create this curve, and then go from there and augment it and get it to a level where you want to, you know, create a bit of a valley or a higher area and that sort of thing. So you want to go and use the Replicate tool, and what that does is it extrudes based on this shape. So you can see here it's been extruded outwards. Alright, just hit home and that'll get you back. And that is really all you need to do with this. Then you just go in, go to a top view of it, and this is again where you want to grab the scale properties of the shape and just make it fill the screen. Okay, and once we do that, fill the screen. Now it's obviously not going to work as a depth map, but if you go into the 3D options and choose render settings and choose depth, you can actually use this 3D object as your base sort of depth map. Now again, we don't have a lot of color value here because it's not super deep, but what you can do is play around with the height of the actual object, so you stretch it up, and since you are locked in an orthographic view, it's not going to like get any bigger. It's just going to be straight up and straight down, so you can see there. And then just to make this a little bit easier to work with, you just rasterize the 3D layer. Now this is going to have a little bit of stair-steppiness going to it, because you can see obviously the banding that's going on from that curve, that depth map. So we'll just let this update here. Alright, so now here's the curve. Basically what I had drawn, we have here, obviously I've crushed down the height of it, so you just go into the object, stretch it out if you want a little bit taller. There you go. If you want a little bit shorter, whatever, you just want a slight incline. It's really, you have a lot of options for how to play around with it. So obviously these lines here aren't going to look that good, so you're going to want to cover it up with some, noise or something like that, depending on what you're making, or smooth it out by going in and blurring that rasterized 3D layer. So go back into the depth map now, and usually I'm making some sort of rocky terrain or some sort of naturally occurring terrain. So I mean, clouds works great for that. So again, just use not fractal noise, it's clouds. Clouds when you're in Photoshop. So okay, and just set it to multiply, and then just turn the opacity way down. And what that'll do is create that sort of mottled effect. So go back to your 3D model, okay, and you can see there it is. So this would work well for sort of a valley, rock cliffs, that sort of thing. And again, you can just go back in to the depth map and use curves again to create that level, that flat level if you're wanting. And to show you a little bit about how this curves adjustment works, so I want to make a flat area and say that's my one sort of flat area, but I also want to make another flat area here. I'm just showing you this because it's actually not going to affect, it's only going to create one flat area, because if you look on the curve setting itself, that sort of little histogram that shows the shape of basically where there is value, and since there's no really low value where I drew that curve, it's not going to affect it. So this is the one curve that I drew. It looks pretty natural. There's a lot you could do with this. This would work well for like the tank video that I did, for example. Alright, so now I'm just going to go in and add another curves adjustment, making this sort of flatter area. So this will work really well for if you're doing a valley or something like that. Throw a really good texture on there, something with a nice normal map, and it'll look really good. So now I'm just going to go back in. You can see here, I don't need these curves here because it doesn't actually affect anything. So now, if I were to take the curves and move them up a bit higher, what it'll do is it'll create more of a top of a cliff and then gradually go down into that valley again. And this is what I'm going to be using for the very first shape here. So you can see there it's a lot more uniform on top. So now you have sort of this flat cliff top and then the valley below, which is quite jagged still. And this is actually one I'm going to be exporting, bringing it into Element and showing you sort of how I would set this up in Element, and a few things on how that works as well. Another important thing to remember is your camera views. It's at the top of the screen in Photoshop. You can actually choose different options for your camera views, like a top view, which is really great. Whenever I export the OBJs, I always just, as a default, sort of go to that top view. And that just is a great way for me to know, yes, I didn't rotate the model too much, or it's head straight on, it's not going to cause any problems when I bring it into Element, because anything that you can do to minimize the amount of dorking around you have to do with the actual model once you get there is great. So make sure it's all square, make sure it's not causing any problems or anything like that, make sure it's not been rotated too much. If it's on an angle, you'll be able to see that in a top view. Okay, and then all you have to do is go to 3D, export 3D layer, choose OBJ. If you do have a texture on there, you can choose JPEG as your output of your materials, because it'll allow you to use it in Element. If it's a Photoshop layer or something like that, you'll have to bring it in as a custom layer. So alright, so now what I'm going to do is just create a second OBJ from this same exact shape that we created. So this one I'm going to do is just pass through the actual cliff, or sort of like a road that's been cut into the cliffside and then into the valley as well. So first I'm just drawing, a nice sort of hard-edged gray line, and then covering that over again real quick with a more feathered gray line. And I just grabbed a gray color from the model that was, not quite the darkest, but not, as light as some of the other areas, and then just create maybe a little offshoot here. I don't know, something you would have in there. Alright, so this is the valley, or the road that's been dug into this cliff, and it'll update. Alright, there's the road there. Now obviously it's really going to be perfect because I use like a solid color, and it's really straight on. It was a flat color and it's just straight on, so you just go back into the depth map and just make it slightly opaque. And what that'll do is it'll let some of that noise, some of that cloud shape, or that cloud texture come through a little bit, and just make it not quite so perfect. Because usually when you're dealing with something that's a naturally occurring, or even if it's carved out, it's still going to be, have some of that sort of rock type feel left over. Alright, so then just go back in to top view, make sure I didn't rotate or do anything stupid. Alright, go to export 3D layer, choose OBJ. I'm just exporting to the desktop and call this one with the road. Alright, I don't care about my textures because I don't have any really that are important on here. And then go into After Effects. Alright, so now that we've made the OBJs, we want to bring them into After Effects. So just start a new composition. I usually go with 1280 by 720 and create a nice bright solid, and that'll be the element layer. Alright, and no mask shapes this time to draw, just go straight into the scene setup in Element. Alright, then choose Import and direct it to where your objects are. So we'll do the Valley one first, and then Valley Road after that. So first we bring in the Valley, and it'll just take a second to load. There you go. Looks pretty good. So this is how I would use a model like this, is sort of be on this cliff looking over, because you can have, then an image map as a background that's even farther beyond that, or even just a sky map, whatever you like. Alright, so I'm just going to use some of the ground textures from Pro Shaders. They're really great textures. They don't loop too badly. Obviously they don't look that good when you throw them on initially. It's just because it's a giant looking map and you're throwing a very small looking texture on it. So what's important is to actually adjust, instead of having to go into all three maps of this shader, you can go into the actual valley model itself and choose the amount of times the UV repeats. And if you do it here, it'll just make it a lot easier, because that means anytime you drag on a new texture, you don't have to go and adjust each of those maps in that property. You can just throw it on and have sort of that baseline, or a decided that's going to be, okay, this model takes basically 10 repeats or 20 repeats or whatever, and that'll just make things a lot easier when you're switching materials around quite a bit. And that's what I did here. Is I didn't end up going with this first texture. I switched it maybe twice before I was happy with it. But alright, so this is just getting the actual scene set up, kind of like how I would use it. So yeah, I'm just wasn't quite happy with the texture that I had, so just playing around with it. I think I ended up going with one of the rock ones. Yeah, so the nice thing is you can just switch it up like that, and you're not having to go in and change, okay, here's the diffuse number of repeats, here's the normal map number of repeats, here's the specular. You don't have to change all three of those options. You just have to change the one option, and it sort of works across the board. Okay, this is the one I went with. Yeah, I like this texture. It's nice, has enough variation, but it's not so smooth like the other ones were. It just didn't look rocky enough for me. Another thing that's really important before you actually get into the real meat and potatoes of setting up the scene itself is to go into the valley and scale it up a ton. So I usually go with like 1,000 right off the bat, and what that does is it just makes it huge. You'll see it update there. And so it'll be a lot easier for setting up things, especially if you're going to use depth of field. If you use depth of field, it'll be, if you leave it at 100%, it'll just be such a tight margin that it's going to be really hard to use. It'll be like, trying to film, your high school diorama with an old VHS camera. It just won't work, really. It'll be cumbersome, and you'll have to have such a tight sort of viewing area. It just won't be good. So scale it up, make it big, because it's ground, it's land, it's quite large, so that works out well. And then when you turn on the depth of field, it's not creating such a such a far away viewing distance that makes it really a pain to work with. So often I like to go into two views. Two views go into a top view as well. The top view is helpful just for, placing cameras or, adjusting where, sort of things are. And you can use the unified camera tool to actually show more of the actual area, which is really handy. Alright, so just go back to the scene here. And I'm going to throw in a ramp background in there. It's two reasons. One, you just need, sort of a little bit more to go on, because you want your scene, you're going for a certain look. Is it sunset? Is it midday? What is it? So to help set that up, you got to have that sort of baseline, and it also gives you an idea of what color to use for, say, if you're going to use fog. So that haze, that's going to be created to create that level of depth that you want. What color is that haze going to be? Is it going to be gray? No, it's going to be close to the sky color. So that's why it's good to bring in the sky, sort of have an idea of what you're dealing with, what the scene is itself. So here I just went with sort of a generic, sort of just a ramp, and that's kind of like a midday, It's not too much color in the sky or anything like that. It's not an alien planet, some Earth-like planet, or somewhere on Earth. Now when you're wanting to create depth, fog is a great way to do that. And so, like I said, you choose the color based on the actual sky color, and it'll create a lot more believability and make the actual items in your scene mesh more with like an image of the sky, or perhaps another texture that you had brought in as a background color or an environment. You want to have your fog match that so that it all meshes and looks good, like one solid piece, not like the ground is one color and the sky is completely different without any sort of cohesion between it. Usually when I'm playing around with fog, I like to turn it up to 100% right away, the opacity, just to get it set, and then move it down after that. And also, if you look at the range and then the start distance is how far away from the camera the fog begins. And so again, since we scaled up the model itself, this is a lot more easier to use because it's closer to what the depth would be. Whereas if you had left it really small, it would be so close, it'd be a lot harder to work with, like that 3000 number at the bottom, the base default range it starts with. That would be so far away from your object where it is that it wouldn't really factor in until you dial it down to like 500 or something like that. So that's another reason that you want to scale it up, just make it a lot easier to work with. You can see here, you also want to create sort of different levels of depth. If you just have sort of a fog that it works sort of on the background area, just a flat surface, it doesn't look as good as if you have sort of one rock here is closer, and so it's a little bit lighter. The one beside it is a little farther back, so it's a bit darker or a bit more foggy there, and then so on and so on. You want to create that depth, and that's why tightening up the range and the start area is really important. Okay, so that's pretty much all I do usually, is my sort of base setup of a environment. Now I'm just going to do the other one, the road one, as well. So what I did is I duplicated my element layer, and I'm just going to keep this one initially so I can get some of the properties from it, just so I don't forget them. So here's the valley with the road here. How I'd want to use a shot like this would be more sort of you're in the valley looking down the road a little bit and see the rocks off in the distance. And you can see here the long triangles that we were talking about earlier. There they are again. So there are some solutions for that, and we'll be getting to that in just a minute. Also, point cloud is like, if you want to use this for like a heads-up display or something like that, or a computer interface, that would look kind of cool. Just saying that as well. Alright, so here's that same rock texture that I used on the other one. And remember, we want to actually adjust and make sure that we have the number of repeats that we want. And that'll create a lot nicer looking map. Now you see those long triangles rearing their ugly head again, stretching this map. So this is where the actual UV options come in. So you see on the flat surfaces on the sort of top down views, that looks great, but then you see on the actual side walls there, it doesn't look very good. This is where you want to use more of a box UV. And what that means is anything that's on a side view, it sort of projects the map onto that side a lot more uniformly. It's not stretching it, so you get a lot better texturing using that with this type of model as well. Now you can see here there is a little bit of where the UV tears a bit along this line here, but since it is a natural break, it's really hard to notice, so that works pretty good. So this is kind of where I want the camera actually set up as well. I'm just going to delete this one as well because I have it in the other element layer. Okay, so now just go back into the scene and it'll update. There it is. And so like I was saying, for this I'd want a lot more like lower shot. Like this is, you know, sort of like the vault video that I did, where you have the, you know, the camera weaving through a really cool, you know, set of corridors, maybe some near misses, that sort of thing. That's kind of what you want with a scene like this. The depth of field really helps in getting the sense of, you know, scale as well as the shape. So this would be a great starting point to have the camera zip through this valley. So another thing you can do that I did with the vault video, if you duplicate this layer and set it to the actual particle array, and then add in, say, these 3 boulders from the starter pack, and set them all to group 2 along with the particle array, and then turn the size on these boulders way down as well, because I don't want them to be giant, I just want them to be like a nice detail to it as well. So turn them down to about 10%, and you can adjust this later, and also you can adjust, you know, the scale of these items in the options once you're outside the scene setup, but whatever you can do in advance, whatever you can do beforehand is always better, because it just makes things a lot easier to use. So now, since we have group 2 there, you can't see it right now, but it is there. It'll be one of the boulders has appeared because we have 1 particle, but if you go to 3D object, what it does is it takes, the default is 10%, so it'll take now 10% of the vertices in that OBJ that we created, and it's gonna put a particle on each of those vertices. And you can see a perfect example of those long triangles on the side walls. There's hardly as many as on the ground. That's because there's that many more vertices on the ground layer, on the flat layer, as opposed to the vertical. So just turn that down quite a bit more. Alright, and so adding these you know, darker boulders in here on this sort of lighter brown texture has really given the impression that I've made a pile of chocolate chip cookie dough, which is okay. It's important to go in, you want to change the random rotation of your boulders, or else they're all going to be facing the same way. Even though you have 3 different ones, it's going to start to look like they're all facing the same way, so just dial up the random rotation, as well as do a little bit of scale random as well. And what that'll do is just, you know, create that sort of variation again, because it's a natural structure. It's not like you're trying to create, you know, something that's very perfect. You want something that's more random looking. And if I, you know, textured these rocks a little bit differently, a little bit closer to the rock color I was using, it would look a bit more natural. But I kind of like how it looks like a chocolate chip cookie valley. It's like a cookie mountain. And then another thing that's important to remember is you have surface offset, and what that does is it pushes the items off or toward the model, so you can actually have the rocks partially buried more in the terrain, which is, you know, a nice way to help seal it up as well, make it look that much nicer. Throw some ambient occlusion on, that looks really good. And that is basically what I do when I want some quick terrain, don't want to have to go into a 3D program, don't have time to. Alright, so there you have it. This is how I create some simple 3D terrain in Photoshop and import it into After Effects using Element 3D. And if you check out the description, I have a link in there to a file which contains a number of OBJs that I've used in various projects or just made for fun. The canyon from the vault video that I did, that's in there. A crater that I made last night that no one's seen but me, that's in there. Yeah, so play around with them, use them, make your own videos with them. If you post them somewhere, maybe put a link to my channel in the description, that'd be great. Send some people my way and let people know where you got them. That being said, I'm not a professional Photoshop 3D terrain maker, so they're not perfect, but they work for the projects that I've been doing. People seem to like those. Alright, thanks for watching. I hope you found this informative. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments or send me a message. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and share it however you do. And if you want to see more, visit my channel and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.